even before O'Hare, Chicago had the world's busiest airport.
Midway was the place at which air travel evolved.
In the days when flying meant more than just getting on a plane, Midway was an aerial theater.
It was the most pandemonious atmosphere I think a person could step into.
Exciting, glamorous, and challenging.
A couple of times I thought, well, that house on the end is going to have an airplane in its yard.
The jet age nearly proved Midway's downfall, but like the toughest Chicagoan, it survived. Midway Airport, crossroads of the world, next on Chicago Stories. Good evening, I'm John Calloway, and welcome to Chicago Stories. The World Trade Center disaster has put a new and dark perspective on flying, airports, and airplanes. Tonight, though, we'd like to take you back to a time when flying was an adventure of a different kind, new and thrilling. The hub of this adventure in Chicago was not O'Hare Airport, but Midway, which is celebrating its 75th anniversary in 2001. Midway was the city's first airport and for decades the world's busiest. It was also one of Chicago's premier attractions, with a legacy full of not only takeoffs and landings, but of drama, romance, and controversy. On a sunny day in 1940, baby Sheila O'Carroll basked in the sun as her doting father, Scotty O'Carroll, pushed her carriage. Many families have home movies, but notice the background in this old footage, a propeller. And in this photo, Sheila is sitting on an airplane wing. This is Midway Airport, and Sheila O'Carroll grew up here.
Midway was home. That's where I learned to roller skate, and I learned to drive a car, and I learned to all the skills children learn growing up.
Her father's company, Monarch Air Service, fueled and fixed planes at Chicago's Midway, the world's busiest airport in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. It was an era when air travel was special. Shiny planes parked at the gate while passengers dressed in their finest clothes as if going out for a night on the town. Scotty O'Carroll was a pilot who owned several planes. He ran a side charter business and gave sightseeing tours. His wife sold tickets at $3.50 apiece. He loved taking Chicagoans up in the air, many for the first time. The novelty of a 20-minute plane ride over the city was unforgettable.
See Chicago from the air, the Loop, the lakefront, Navy Pier. Can you imagine a more thrilling thing? Even nowadays, how many people have flown in little planes where you really feel it? It's right there.
From the time O'Carroll came to Midway, the airport was one of the centers of air travel. In the early years, following the Wright brothers' first manned flight at Kitty Hawk in 1903, the nation was fascinated with aviation, and many people tried building their own planes. Chicago's Aero Club sponsored air shows like this one in Grant Park and built airfields that drew people from around the country who wanted to learn how to fly.
Chicago was a technological a wonderland in a sense. It was the Silicon Valley of its day.
World War I established that biplanes were reliable, first for reconnaissance, then as means to attack the enemy. The post office had another use in mind, speeding up mail delivery, first by using Army pilots and planes, and later by hiring planes and pilots of its own. In time, a transcontinental route developed, though it was hardly nonstop.
The range of the planes in those days was relatively short, so they had to make a series of hops across the country.
Just as it was for the railroads, Chicago's central location made it a natural stopping point for planes traveling between coasts. Chicago's first Airmail landing strip was in Grant Park, just north of the Field Museum. But when a blimp crash over the loop killed 13 people in 1919, local officials all but eliminated flights over the city.
The city immediately began to clamp down on aviation, and this was certainly a factor in the fact that the Airmail service decided to move its Chicago operation from the city out to the suburbs.
Airmail moved to Checkerboard Field and then Maywood Field in Maywood. Pilots flew between Chicago and other Midwestern cities. One of those on the Chicago to St. Louis route was a young Charles Lindbergh, about 1 year before he made his legendary solo flight across the Atlantic. But the post office wanted private contractors to carry airmail from the beginning. A federal law in 1925 accomplished that and helped launch airline companies. The airline business was quickly expanding, and Chicago's leaders wanted a piece of it. For the first time since the 1919 blimp disaster, building an up-to-date airport within the city limits became a priority. The city leased some land from the Board of Education, which owned a remote square mile between 55th and 63rd Streets and from Cicero to Central Avenues. The airfield opened on May 8, 1926. On December 12, 1927, Mayor William Hale Thompson looked the part when he officially welcomed the airlines to Chicago Municipal Airport. Its name would later change to Midway after the World War II battle. Among the tenants were the new airline companies, including those that would become United and American Airlines.
Midway was a superior airport to most that existed at the time. It had cinder runways, it had plenty of room, it had beacons.
Midway was also a showcase for the city.
Midway was created and dedicated at an era when the Chicago business community was especially concerned about its image. This was the excitement of the new technology, the excitement of something that would be encountered by visitors and would become a tourist attraction on its own.
Chicagoans were fascinated by the magic of flight and the opportunity to be close to the aircraft.
The Chicago Police Department has to have a separate police detail for the airport, and their major job is to keep people from wandering out into the field to watch planes take off.
I was probably 9 or 10. We'd stop at every hangar and try to talk to the pilots or the mechanics or anybody working on the airplane. When I started going with my wife, our big days was I'd take her out and watch the airplanes take off and land.
People would come and bring their picnic lunch and bring their little thermos bottle full of whatever, and they'd sit there and have sandwiches and talk, and then they'd point out the airplanes.
In 1934, 1/4 of all U.S. airmail passed through Midway. But while the mail business was lucrative, some airlines were already exploring other options, such as flying passengers. The arrangement was somewhat informal at first.
Now, if they had room on top of the mailbags, somebody who wanted to sit on top of mailbags could go along for the ride.
In the early 30s, the airlines were paid larger government subsidies for flying bigger, faster, and safer planes. Carrying passengers was now good for business. Air travel at Midway became more formal and the trips more sophisticated. Back in those days, travelers had to weigh in before each flight to ensure the plane's load would be distributed evenly. A trip from Minneapolis to Midway aboard a Ford Trimotor included a stop in Rochester, Minnesota, and took 3 hours and 15 minutes, about 1/3 of the time of a train trip. And every flight was a special occasion.
To see the men with their polished shoes and their fedoras, the ladies would have on those nice little frilly skirts. I'm imagining them right now in my mind and thinking that we've lost something over the years.
Cabins weren't pressurized back then, so pilots had to fly low, often at altitudes of 5,000 feet and less. The rides could be pretty rough from takeoff to landing, and motion sickness was common.
There was a lot of vibration, unbelievable noise in it, air leaks and things of this sort.
But for those who were there, the adventure more than made up for the lack of luxury.
I loved flying, first of all. Just the fact that you were flying, you know, was a good feeling.
Agnes Nohava Hanks was one of the first stewardesses. Most airlines required them to be registered nurses so that they could care for passengers who became ill. But over the years, stewardesses provided less medical attention and more personal attention. And it was a shrewd investment for the airlines.
Most people were afraid to fly those days. They needed an incentive, so they decided that they would put young women on, and that would bring passengers, which is exactly what happened. We never served liquor on board those days, but some of them would be nervous enough to bring their own.
But in 1932, a president-to-be gave airline travel and Midway a boost. That summer, the Democrats held their convention in Chicago and nominated New York Governor Franklin Delano Roosevelt for president.
He's entitled to the nomination.
Roosevelt decided to accept the nomination in person, something which had never been done before. He hoped his gesture would lift the spirits of the country during the Great Depression.
Upon word of his nomination, Governor Roosevelt broke all precedents the way he had by flying to Chicago.
A crowd of more than 10,000 greeted his chartered American Airlines plane when it landed at Midway.
I think that was a very important factor in the campaign on the safety of flying. It's a picture of him getting off the plane in Chicago with this mob of people around him. I don't know that it made every paper in the country, but it certainly made the big ones.
Roosevelt's trip also solidified Midway's importance to aviation.
If you were to build a commercial airplane, it had to be able to fly in and out of Midway, because that's where the center of everything was.
By 1936, larger planes, such as the 21-passenger DC-3, allowed the airlines to carry more people. But as their size increased, airplanes required more room on the runways to take off and land. And Midway had another problem. A busy train line ran nearby. When Midway's runway space expanded, the tracks ran down the middle of the field and had to go. World War II saw Midway used heavily as a gateway for sailors training at the Great Lakes Naval Station in Glenview. After the war, Midway was operating at a frenetic pace. Flying became more reliable and more affordable. Fares plummeted as more people took to traveling by air. The new terminal, which was completed in 1947, was routinely packed.
The first time I looked at that terminal, I said, they'll never fill this up. And within a matter of months, there was no space to sit down, there was no space to get to the ticket counters.
First time I flew into Midway when I was on furlough, I thought, boy, this ain't a place I'd want to work because I'm afraid somebody'd run me over.
The world's busiest airport rapidly evolved, becoming a proving ground for procedures that would soon become common at all airports.
When you think of all the systems that go on in an airport today, they had to be invented by trial and error, and much of this trial and error happened at Midway Airport.
The airport also became a destination for those who weren't flying. A trip to Midway meant adventure. Whether or not you were taking grandmother to her plane, or just taking in the atmosphere from the terminal's observation deck.
We just stood there entranced, right in line with the tops of the tails of these beautiful aircraft. It was like watching the best choreographed system in the world. It sounded like all of Chicago turning on their electric fans, because you could hear hundreds and hundreds of blades taking huge bites out of the air.
Marshall Fields took advantage of Midway's popularity when it opened the Cloud Room in 1948. The restaurant's decor was an attraction in itself. Floor-to-ceiling windows provided picturesque views of the field. One year, the Cloud Room served more than 3 million customers.
They'd come all the way from Oak Park, or who knows where they came from, to eat at the Cloud Room. Mother's Day was the big day of the year, and I remember vividly the long, long lines. And those poor mothers were in agony, waiting to get into the Cloud Room to eat.
If Field's reputation for fine food added to the restaurant's popularity, so did the prospect of spotting celebrities flying into Midway.
Marilyn Monroe was there, Bob Hope, and he could remember my name when he'd come back.
But the planes were the main attraction. Midway's carnival-like atmosphere of pinwheels and popcorn, coupled with a short ride above the city in a Scotty O'Carroll Monarch Air Service plane, sent hearts and imaginations soaring.
We'd say, if you live near the airport, maybe we'll go over your house. We tell kids to save their nickels and dimes so that they could go up, and sometimes if they didn't have quite enough, you let them go anyway.
O'Carroll further expanded his business after World War II when he created Monarch Air Coach. He posted ads soliciting passengers for trips to other cities at cut-rate prices. When he sold all the seats, the flight left Midway.
It was an important part of history because, again, they promoted aviation travel for the common man.
In 1948, more than 220,000 flights a year were taking off or landing at Midway. And no one, oddly, had a better view of the planes at Midway than the students at Nathan Hale School. The edge of the school building sat barely 100 yards from two of the runways.
The entire building would vibrate, the window panes would vibrate, the ink in the ink wells would kind of ripple out, and the chalk on the bottom of the chalkboard would kind of do a nice little dance. You weren't allowed to look out the window, because you look out the window, the teacher grabs you by the hair, you're down in the book, and the book seems awful interesting.
This footage shows Hale students at a May Day celebration near the school. Watch the middle of the picture. The students are so unaffected as this plane passes, they don't even notice it. The planes are so low, they seem almost within reach.
They don't call Midway the close-in airport for nothing. You could actually see the people inside of the plane looking out the window.
Airport officials later closed the two runways when school was in session. In 1955, the school was slated for demolition over concern for student safety. Midway's runways were crowded. Bob Zielinski and Buck Hilbert had each achieved their boyhood dreams of becoming aviators and flew in and out of the airport during its busiest days.
If there was a calm day or the wind was out of the west or something, they'd use both the runways, the southwest runways and the northwest runways at the same time. And that could be a little bit of excitement because the runways crossed right in the middle of the airport. If those controllers had gone by the book in those days, nothing would have moved.
One time, air traffic controllers were so busy, Hilbert and his flight crew couldn't get their attention to taxi to a gate.
And finally, the captain took his red handkerchief out of his pocket, opened the window, and started waving his handkerchief at the tower. And it got a good laugh, and then the tower said, "Okay, United, you're clear to cross."
As Midway grew, so did the area around it. By the 1940s, what had been a remote location was the center of a busy city neighborhood.
When we look around the country, we don't see any other airports that are built in the bungalow belt. You can describe it as the Wrigley Field of airports.
Homes, businesses, and industry now hemmed in Midway. This unique layout could challenge pilots on every flight.
And the guys that didn't like to fly in and out of there stayed away. You had to get on the ground and get out of the way. Frankly, it was a test each and every time you came into land. It required real precision.
I was proud to fly out of Midway. I can remember a few landings where the pucker factor went up when we were sliding down the runway or hydroplaning on the water. And a couple of times I thought, well, that house on the end is going to have an airplane in its yard.
But while Midway's runways were often challenging for propeller-driven aircraft, they would prove to be too short to accommodate the new commercial jets, like the 707, which came into service in the late 50s. This was not the first threat to Midway's dominant role in aviation, but it would be the most serious.
Through most of its history, it was always looking over its shoulder at something that would replace it.
As early as 1945, the city had found a site for a new airport. It was Orchard Field, next to the old Douglas Aircraft Assembly Plant, 18 miles from the Loop, with plenty of space to grow.
That's where they decided to build the airport to replace, or initially to augment Midway. They never envisioned it as totally as a replacement.
In 1949, the field was renamed O'Hare International Airport, after heroic World War II Navy pilot Edward Butch O'Hare. By 1955, O'Hare opened to commercial air traffic. And 4 years later, the 707 was taking off and landing on its longer runways. The rest of the airline's operations soon followed.
All the airlines didn't want to pay for 2 hangars, one at Midway and one at O'Hare, 2 ticket booths, 2 double facilities in Chicago. So early in the 60s, there was a stampede to O'Hare once the airport was fully completed.
Midway became outmoded. The title of world's busiest airport moved to O'Hare in 1962. Private planes still used Midway, and Monarch Air Service fueled and serviced them. But over the next 17 years, the commercial airlines operation slowed and even stopped for a time. Midway was a ghost town.
Was grass growing in the cracks on the runways?
It went from a blooming, teeming metropolis type of an operation to nothing.
Perhaps the most remembered event during this period was an infamous one. On December 8, 1972, a 737 passenger jet from Washington, D.C. crashed into a residential area on its approach to Midway. 43 people on board were killed, including the wife of E. Howard Hunt, the ex-CIA operative tied to the Watergate break-in. Mrs. Hunt's purse, found in the wreckage, contained $10,000 in cash that was rumored to be linked to the cover-up, but no connection was ever proved. As for Midway, new federal regulations would inspire its renaissance. In 1978, President Jimmy Carter signed legislation that deregulated the airline industry.
What they did was to open up routes that had been reserved for only a few carriers. They allowed airlines to reduce fares.
Carriers would find a good match at Midway, whose nearly empty space was cheap and available, and whose runways could safely accommodate the new generation of jets. Among the first new deregulated carriers was Midway Airlines. It breathed life into the airport for which it had been named.
I flew one of the earlier flights out of Midway Airlines in 1979. It expanded and really saved the airport.
Midway Airlines showed that a post-deregulation airline operating in an efficient manner could operate successfully at Midway Airport, and thereby it opened the door for the Southwests and the ATAs and the others who are there now.
Today, Midway has grown to include 8 budget carriers. Major airlines, including American and Northwest, operate there as well. In 1997, the city of Chicago announced a $722 million renovation project, including a new terminal building.
But I think also the convenience factor, as the airport got bigger and began to move more people, that it lost that kind of innocent charm that it once had.
Still, Midway has made a significant comeback. Once again, it is a critical part of U.S. air travel.
I think it was very important that it didn't die. I think we would have a genuine crisis now in terms of air travel here, because Midway has always been the accordion. You expand it when you need it, you contract it when you don't.
Some things haven't changed. Midway is again the busiest square mile in aviation. And now that the runways are lined with jets, Midway still demands precision flying.
Not only are the runways fairly short and hemmed in by what in the aviation world are called obstructions, and you and I would call houses, but the approaches to Midway Airport require that you avoid things like the Sears Tower.
Midway's piloting challenges are just one reminder of what made it a cherished place for Chicagoans.
It was our airport. There was a camaraderie about that airport. Anybody that worked there was proud of the fact that this was our airport.
All my life, all my memories are Midway. It was a lovely time. It was my childhood. It was exciting. It was a carnival.
Midway ran thick in the veins of the O'Carrolls for 66 years. Scotty passed away in 1961, but Monarch Air Service stayed in the family until it was sold in 1997. The memories of Monarch's hangar, Scotty's planes, and the picturesque skyline are lovingly stitched into a quilt on the wall of his daughter's home.
It's very meaningful to our family. It's the Midway we knew.
Midway Airport attracted more than 15 million passengers in the year 2000, 5 million more than in its heyday in 1959. But now it remains to be seen what long-term effects the terror attack will have on air travel in general and Midway in particular. I'm John Callaway. Thank you and good night. On the next Chicago Stories,
it was a disaster waiting to happen.
Look out, she's tipping.
Gigantic disaster right in the middle of downtown Chicago.
Chicago Stories, Monday nights at 7:30 on WTTW 11.